The city of Thalmara had been burning for 3 days straight. Smoke rose from every corner of what was once the most beautiful capital on Valoria Prime. Buildings that had stood for 1,000 years now lay in ruins. Streets that once held markets and festivals were covered in ash and debris. The orange sky above was blocked by massive black warships that hung in the air like death itself, waiting to strike again. "Commander." Cirith pressed his back against a broken wall and tried to catch his breath. His blue scales had turned pale gray from exhaustion and fear. Around him sat the last survivors of his defense unit. 40 soldiers remained from what had been a force of 500. They had fought for 6 days without rest and without hope. Their weapons were nearly empty. Their shields had stopped working hours ago. They had nothing left but their will to keep fighting. The Krath Dominion had arrived without any warning. 6 days ago, the sky had darkened with their warships. They sent a message demanding complete surrender. They wanted Valorian genetic material for their twisted experiments. They wanted to harvest the people of Valoria like crops in a field. When the Valorian government refused their demands, the bombardment began. Cirith looked around at his soldiers. Some of them were barely old enough to hold a weapon. Others were veterans who had served beside him for decades. All of them wore the same expression on their faces. It was the look of people who knew they were going to die. They had accepted it. They were simply waiting for the end to come. A young female named Yalith sat near him working on a communication device that had been damaged in the last attack. She was his communications officer and one of the bravest soldiers he had ever known. Her scales had lost their healthy color just like his own. Dark circles surrounded her eyes from days without sleep. Cirith moved closer to her and spoke in a quiet voice. He asked if there had been any response from the Galactic Coalition. He already knew the answer, but he needed to hear it spoken aloud. Perhaps some small part of him still held on to hope. Yalith shook her head slowly. She told him that the Coalition had declared their sector a non-intervention zone. The message had been very clear. They said that engaging the Krath would risk starting a wider war. They said the cost was too high. They offered their sympathies and nothing more. A bitter laugh escaped from Cirith. The Galactic Coalition had made many promises when Valoria joined their organization. They had promised protection and security. They had promised that no member species would ever stand alone against aggression. Those promises had turned out to be worth nothing at all. When the real threat came, the Zillian Coalition had abandoned them. Behind the broken wall where his soldiers hid, there was a large temple. Inside that temple, nearly 2,000 civilians had taken shelter. They were mostly children and elderly Valorians who could not fight. They had nowhere else to go. The rest of the city had been destroyed or occupied by Krath forces. This small area was the last free zone in the entire capital. Cirith looked toward the temple and felt his heart grow heavy. Those people were depending on him and his soldiers to protect them. They were looking at him with eyes full of hope because they did not understand how hopeless the situation had become. He had no way to save them. He could only delay the inevitable for a few more hours at most. The sound of Krath drop pods filled the air. It was a high whining noise that Cirith had learned to hate over the past 6 days. More ground forces were coming. The bombardment had done its work, and now the Krath were sending soldiers to finish what the bombs had started. They would sweep through the ruins and capture anyone who still lived. Those people would be taken to harvesting ships, where their genetic material would be extracted. It was a fate worse than death. Cirith stood up and faced his soldiers. He kept his voice steady even though his heart was racing. He told them that it had been an honor to serve with each of them. He told them that they had fought bravely and that their families would be proud. He told them that they would make their last stand here and that they would take as many Krath with them as possible. His soldiers rose to their feet one by one. They checked their weapons and took their positions along the broken walls. No one spoke. No one cried. They simply prepared to do their duty until the very end. Cirith moved to a gap in the wall, where he could see the plaza in front of them. The first Krath soldiers were already appearing at the far edge. They were massive creatures standing over 8 feet tall. Their bodies were covered in natural armor that made them almost impossible to hurt with Valorian weapons. Behind them came their war beasts, which were horrible creatures created through genetic manipulation. Those beasts existed only to kill, and they were very good at their purpose. More Krath poured into the plaza. There were hundreds of them forming ranks and preparing to advance. Their weapons hummed with deadly energy. Their war beasts snarled and pulled at their chains, eager to be released. Cirith raised his weapon and prepared to give the order to fire. This would be the final battle. He knew that his small force could not stop so many enemies. They would fight and they would fall, and then the Krath would take the civilians. The history of Valoria would end here in this ruined plaza. He looked up at the sky one last time. The Krath warships still hung there, blocking out the sun. There was no help coming. The Coalition had abandoned them. No other species would risk war with the Dominion for the sake of Valoria. They were alone. Cirith whispered a prayer to the old gods that his people had worshipped before they reached the stars. He asked them to watch over his soldiers and to give them courage. He asked them to protect the souls of the innocent people hiding in the temple. He asked them to remember Valoria even after it was gone. Then something strange happened. The sky above began to change. New lights appeared among the Krath warships. At first, Cirith thought it was another wave of bombs. But these lights were different. They were moving too fast and coming from too high. They were entering the atmosphere from space and leaving trails of white fire behind them. The Krath soldiers in the plaza stopped their advance. They too were looking up at the sky. For the first time since the invasion began, Cirith saw something other than confidence on their faces. He saw confusion. He saw uncertainty. The lights grew brighter and closer. The sound they made was like nothing Cirith had ever heard before. It was a screaming roar that shook the ground and made his bones vibrate. Whatever was falling from the sky, it was coming directly toward them. Cirith lowered his weapon and stared upward. Hope was a dangerous thing for a soldier who had accepted death. But in that moment, he felt something stir in his chest. Something was happening. Something was about to change everything. The first object struck the ground 50 meters from his position. 300 light years away from Valoria Prime, a massive warship moved through the darkness of space. The ship was called the USS Resolute, and it was one of the newest vessels in the human fleet. It carried 2,000 Marines who were trained for combat in any environment. It held 3 squadrons of fighter craft that could operate in space or in atmosphere. Most importantly, it was equipped with hundreds of orbital drop pods that could deliver soldiers to any planet. Surface within minutes, Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair on the bridge of the Resolute. He was a man in his early 40s, with gray showing at his temples and lines on his face that told stories of difficult decisions. He had served in the Terran military for over 20 years. He had seen combat on a dozen worlds. He knew what war looked like, and he knew what it cost. But he had never turned away from a fight that needed to be fought. On this day, he was reviewing intelligence reports on his personal screen. Most of the reports were routine matters that required little attention. But one report had caught his eye, and he kept returning to it again and again. It was a distress signal that had been intercepted from a distant system. The signal came from Valoria Prime. His executive officer approached him with a tablet in her hands. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Amy Lawson, and she had served with Morrison for 5 years. She was younger than him, but just as experienced in her own way. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her blue eyes were sharp with intelligence. She never wasted words, and she never showed fear. Amy told him that they had confirmed the details of the distress signal. Valorian forces were being attacked by the Krath Dominion. The invasion had been going on for 6 days. Civilian casualties were estimated in the millions. The Valorian military was almost completely destroyed. Morrison asked what the coalition response had been. He kept his voice calm, but inside he already felt anger building. He knew how the coalition operated. He knew what their answer would be. Amy confirmed his suspicions. The Galactic Coalition had declared Valoria a non-intervention zone. They had decided that fighting the Krath was too risky. They were going to let an entire civilization be destroyed rather than take action. Morrison stood up from his chair and walked to the main display screen at the front of the bridge. The screen showed a map of local space with Valoria Prime highlighted in blue and green. Red markers surrounded the planet indicating the positions of Krath warships. There were 15 enemy vessels holding orbit over the dying world. He asked Amy how many civilians were still alive on the planet. She checked her tablet and told him that estimates suggested approximately 2 billion Valorians remained. 2 billion people who were going to be harvested for their genetic material. 2 billion people who were going to suffer and die while the galaxy watched and did nothing. Morrison turned to his communications officer. His name was Chris Vega, and he was one of the youngest officers on the bridge. Despite his youth, he was extremely skilled at his job. He could find a signal in the deepest noise, and he could establish a connection across any distance. Morrison ordered Chris to open a secure channel to Fleet Command. He wanted to speak with Admiral Patricia Hayes directly. This was not a decision he could make alone. This was something that would have consequences far beyond this single battle. The connection was established within seconds. Admiral Hayes appeared on the screen. She was an older woman with gray hair and a face that showed decades of service. She had commanded fleets in 3 major conflicts. She had negotiated treaties with hostile species. She was one of the most respected officers in the entire Terran military. And right now she was looking at Morrison with an expression that said she already knew why he was calling. The Admiral spoke first. She said that she had seen the Valoria situation and she understood why Morrison was contacting her. She wanted to know what he was planning to do. Morrison did not hesitate. He requested permission to intervene on Valoria Prime. He wanted to engage the Krath forces and provide humanitarian assistance to the civilian population. He knew what he was asking. He knew the risks involved. Admiral Hayes explained those risks clearly. The coalition had declared non-intervention. If the Resolute went to Valoria, they would be going alone. There would be no backup and no support. There would be political consequences that could affect humanity's position in the galactic community. Earth might face sanctions or worse. Morrison listened to everything she said. Then he gave his response. He told the Admiral that humanity did not join the coalition to watch genocide happen. He said that there were 2 billion people dying on Valoria and that the Terran military had the power to help them. He said that doing nothing was not an option he was willing to accept. Admiral Hayes was silent for a long moment. Her eyes studied Morrison through the screen. She seemed to be weighing every possible outcome and every possible consequence. Finally, she nodded her head slowly. She told Morrison that he was authorized to render humanitarian assistance to Valorian civilians by any means necessary. She would handle the political fallout. His job was to make sure those people survived. Morrison thanked her and ended the transmission. He turned to face his bridge crew. Every officer was watching him and waiting for orders. They had heard the conversation. They knew what was coming. Morrison gave his commands in a clear and steady voice. He ordered all hands to battle stations. He ordered navigation to set course for Valoria Prime at maximum speed. He ordered Amy to wake the Marines and tell them to prepare for combat. He specifically wanted Sergeant Major Ryan Carter to know that they would be conducting an orbital drop as soon as they arrived. The bridge exploded into activity. Officers rushed to their stations and began preparing the ship for war. Alarms sounded throughout the vessel, alerting every crew member that the situation had changed. In the Marine barracks, soldiers began putting on their armor and checking their weapons. Morrison sat back down in his command chair. His hands gripped the armrest tightly. He knew that some of his people would not survive what was coming. He knew that this decision might start a larger conflict with the Krath Dominion. He knew that politicians and diplomats would criticize him for years to come. But he also knew that somewhere on Valoria Prime, there were children hiding in ruins while monsters closed in around them. He knew that there were soldiers fighting to protect civilians, even though they had no hope of victory. He knew that an entire species was facing extinction because no one was willing to help them. The Resolute jumped to faster than light speed, and the stars stretched into lines of light around them. They would arrive at Valoria Prime within hours. And when they arrived, the Krath Dominion would learn something important about humanity. They would learn that humans do not abandon the innocent to die. They would learn that humans fight hardest when the cause is just. They would learn that there are some species in the galaxy who consider surrender to be an impossibility. The Krath had never faced an enemy like this before. They were about to discover why the rest of the galaxy should have been paying more attention to the young species from Earth. War was coming to Valoria Prime, and it was falling from the sky. Commander Sirith had made peace with death. He had accepted that this ruined plaza would be his grave. He had said goodbye to hope and prepared his soul for the end. His soldiers stood ready beside him, knowing that these would be their final moments. The civilians in the temple behind them prayed to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. The Krath forces filled the plaza in front of them. Hundreds of massive warriors in their natural armor stood in perfect formation. Their war beasts strained at their chains, hungry for blood. The Krath commander raised his weapon and prepared to give the order to attack. In seconds, the final battle would begin. Then the sky screamed. The sound was unlike anything Sirith had ever heard. It was a roar that seemed to tear the very air apart. He looked up and saw objects falling through the atmosphere like burning stars. They were moving impossibly fast and leaving trails of white fire behind them. There were hundreds of them raining down from the heavens. The first object struck the ground 50 meters from his position. The impact threw Sirith off his feet and sent him tumbling across the broken stones. Dust and debris filled the air. The ground shook like an earthquake had struck. When he managed to raise his head, he saw a metal pod sitting in a crater where solid ground had been moments before. The pod hissed and its front section exploded outward. Something emerged from inside. At first, Sirith could not understand what he was seeing. The figure was roughly the same shape as a Valorian, but it was covered in heavy armor that made it nearly as large as a Krath warrior. In its hands, it carried a weapon that glowed with energy. Its helmet turned towards Sirith, and a voice came out translated perfectly into his language. The figure identified itself as Sergeant Derek Cole of the Terran Marine Corps. It told Sirith that help had arrived. It ordered him to get his people behind the human line immediately. More pods crashed down around the plaza. Each impact shook the ground and sent more dust into the air. From each pod emerged another human soldier in the same heavy armor. They moved with perfect coordination, forming a defensive line between the Valorian survivors and the Krath forces. Within seconds, there were over 100 human Marines standing in the plaza. The Krath had stopped their advance. For the first time in the entire invasion, they seemed uncertain about what to do. They had expected no resistance. They had expected easy prey. They had not expected soldiers to fall from the sky. Then the humans opened fire. The sound of human weapons was nothing like Valorian energy projectors. Valorian weapons made a soft hissing sound when fired. Human weapons roared like thunder. Each shot was an explosion of kinetic force that crossed the distance to its target almost instantly. The first volley tore through the front rank of Krath soldiers as if their natural armor was made of paper. Cirith watched in disbelief as Krath warriors fell one after another. These were creatures that Valorian weapons could barely scratch. These were monsters that had slaughtered thousands of his people. And now they were dying by the dozen with each passing second. The Krath commander screamed orders to his troops. The war beasts were released from their chains and sent charging toward the human line. These creatures were designed to be unstoppable. They were gene-crafted killing machines that felt no pain and knew no fear. They had torn through Valorian defensive positions like they were nothing. Female human soldiers stepped forward to meet the first war beast. Her armor was marked differently from the others, indicating some kind of rank. The beast leaped at her with claws extended and jaws open wide. What happened next would stay in Cirith's memory forever. The human caught the beast in midair. Her armored hands grabbed it by the throat and twisted her body with incredible strength. She slammed the creature into the ground, hard enough to crack the stone beneath it. Before it could recover, she drew a sidearm from her belt and fired 3 rounds through its skull. The war beast that had been a nightmare to Valorian soldiers died in less than 2 seconds. The female soldier looked up and spoke into her communication device. She identified herself as Lieutenant Laura Chun and reported that the area was secure. She asked Sergeant Cole about the status of the civilian evacuation. He replied that evacuation shuttles were inbound and that Marines had established a defensive perimeter around the temple. Cirith finally managed to stand. His legs felt weak, and his mind was struggling to understand what was happening. Moments ago, he had been preparing to die. Now the plaza was littered with Krath corpses, and human soldiers were tending to wounded. Valorians, with surprising gentleness, Laura removed her helmet and approached him. Her face was young, and her brown eyes were kind. There was nothing in her expression that matched the violence she had just unleashed. She looked at him with concern and asked if he was injured. Cirith could only stare at her. He managed to speak one word. He said that they had come. His voice broke as he said it because he still could not believe it was real. Laura nodded and explained the situation simply. She told him that the Galactic Coalition had refused to help. She told him that humanity had decided to come anyway. She told him that humans do not leave people to die when they have the power to help. Above them, the sky was changing again. The Krath warships that had hung over the city for days were now under attack. Human vessels had arrived in orbit and were engaging the enemy fleet. Bright flashes of light marked explosions as ships fired on each other. The tide of the battle was turning not just on the ground, but in space as well. Lieutenant Laura ordered her soldiers to begin moving the civilians to the evacuation zone. Shuttles were landing in cleared areas throughout the city. Marines were carrying children and helping the elderly walk to safety. Medical teams were treating the wounded with equipment that seemed almost magical to Cirith. Commander Cirith stood among his surviving soldiers and watched the humans work. Tears ran down his gray scales, but he did not wipe them away. For 6 days he had believed that his people were alone. For 6 days he had accepted that Valoria would fall and be forgotten. Now strangers from across the galaxy were fighting and dying to save them. Sergeant Derek Cole approached him and put an armored hand on his shoulder. He told Cirith that his soldiers had fought bravely. He told him that the broadcast signal they had sent had helped the humans find them in time. He told him that without that signal, many more Valorians would have died today. Cirith asked why. It was the only question that mattered. Why would humans risk everything for a species they had never met? Why would they defy the Coalition and invite war with the Dominion? Why would they send their soldiers to die on a foreign world for strangers? Derek was quiet for a moment. Then he gave an answer that Cirith would remember for the rest of his life. He said that a long time ago, humans learned that some things are worth fighting for even if you gain nothing from the fight. He said that letting innocent people die when you can save them is not something humans are willing to do. He said that this is simply who they are. The evacuation continued as the battle raged in the sky above. Thousands of Valorians were carried to safety by human soldiers who had crossed the stars to help them. The Krath ground forces were destroyed or scattered. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable was being pushed back by a single ship and its crew. Valoria Prime would survive. The humans had made sure of that. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Resolute, watching the battle unfold on the main display screen. The situation in orbit had been chaos when they arrived. 15 Krath warships had surrounded the planet like predators around wounded prey. They had not expected any challenge. They had been wrong. The Resolute had emerged from faster-than-light travel with weapons already firing. The first Krath ship had exploded before its crew even understood what was happening. The second ship tried to maneuver away, but human targeting systems were faster and more accurate than anything the Krath had encountered before. Within the first 5 minutes of the engagement, 3 enemy vessels had been destroyed. Morrison watched the tactical display with a calm expression, even though his heart was pounding. This was the largest engagement he had ever commanded. Every decision he made would determine whether people lived or died. He could not afford to make mistakes. Amy Lawson stood beside him, providing constant updates on the battle. She reported that 4 more Krath ships had been disabled and that the remaining enemy vessels were attempting to form a defensive formation. Their flagship was moving toward the rear of the group using smaller ships as shields. Morrison gave orders with precision and clarity. He told the weapons officer to focus fire on the ships protecting the flagship. He wanted to punch a hole through their formation and reach the command vessel. If they could destroy or disable the flagship, the remaining Krath would likely retreat. The Resolute shuddered as an enemy weapon found its mark. Damage reports came in from multiple sections. One of the fighter bays had taken a hit. Casualties were being reported from the lower decks. Morrison acknowledged each report and ordered repair teams to their stations. The ship could still fight. That was all that mattered right now. Chris Vega called out from his station. He reported that Sergeant Major Ryan Carter was requesting an update on the orbital situation. The Marine commander wanted to know if it was safe to begin landing the evacuation shuttles. Morrison checked the display. The area directly above the main evacuation zone was clear of enemy vessels. He told Chris to inform Carter that the shuttles were clear to proceed. They needed to get those civilians off the surface before the Krath could regroup. Another Krath ship exploded on the screen. The Resolute's weapons were tearing through the enemy fleet with devastating effect. Human ships were built differently than most vessels in the galaxy. They were designed for war by a species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years. Every system was redundant. Every weapon was precise. Every crew member was trained to continue fighting, no matter what. The Krath had evolved their military tactics to prey on weaker species. They used terror and overwhelming numbers to crush their enemies. They had never faced an opponent that hit back harder than they did. They were learning that lesson now. Amy reported that the Krath flagship was attempting to break away from the battle. The enemy commander had apparently decided that the fight was lost and was trying to save himself. Morrison shook his head slowly. He was not going to let that happen. He ordered the helm to pursue the flagship. He told weapons to disable its engines, but not destroy it. He wanted that ship intact. He wanted the commander alive. There was a message that needed to be delivered to the Krath Dominion, and he intended to make sure it was received. The chase lasted only minutes. Human ships were faster than Krath vessels, and the Resolute closed the distance quickly. A precise shot from the main battery tore through the flagship's engine section. The massive vessel went dark and began drifting helplessly through space. Morrison ordered a communication channel open to the disabled ship. The screen flickered and then showed the face of a Krath commander. He was a massive creature covered in ritual scars that marked him as a veteran of many campaigns. His compound eyes burned with fury and something that looked very much like fear. The Krath spoke first. His voice was full of rage as he called Morrison a fool. He said that humanity had made a grave error by interfering in Dominion affairs. He promised that the Krath would return with 1,000 ships and destroy Earth. For this insult, Morrison listened to the threats without showing any reaction. When the Krath finished speaking, Morrison leaned forward in his chair and responded in a calm voice. He told the Krath commander to listen very carefully. He explained that the commander would be allowed to leave this system alive. He would return to the Dominion and deliver a message to his masters. The message was simple. Valoria Prime was now under human protection. Any Krath vessel that entered this system again would be destroyed without warning. There would be no negotiation and no mercy for those who violated this boundary. But that was not the entire message. Morrison continued speaking in the same calm voice. He told the commander that if humanity ever learned of the Dominion harvesting another species, the response would be different. Humans would not simply defend. They would attack. They would find the Krath homeworld. They would end the Dominion permanently. Morrison explained that humans did not want war. They did not seek conflict. But there were some evils that could not be allowed to exist. The harvesting of intelligent beings for genetic material was one of those evils. The Krath could change their ways or they could be destroyed. The choice belonged to them. The Krath commander stared at Morrison through the screen. His rage had faded and been replaced by something else. It took Morrison a moment to recognize the expression. It was uncertainty. The Krath had never encountered a species that spoke to them this way. They had never met anyone who was not afraid of them. The commander spoke again. His voice was quieter now. He pointed out that the Resolute was only one ship. Humanity was only one species. They could not stand against the entire Dominion. Morrison smiled. It was not a friendly expression. He told the Krath to try them. He said that humanity had fought wars against themselves for thousands of years before they reached the stars. He said that violence was woven into their very nature. He said that every human alive carried the memories of ancestors who survived impossible odds through sheer determination and will. The Krath thought they knew what war meant. They were wrong. Humanity would show them the true meaning of the word if they forced the issue. Morrison ended the transmission. He ordered the crew to stand down from battle stations and begin recovery operations. The surviving Krath vessels were gathering their damaged ships and preparing to retreat. They had come to Valoria expecting easy prey. They were leaving with less than half their fleet and a warning that would echo through the Dominion for years to come. Amy approached Morrison and stood beside his chair. She told him that the Galactic Coalition had already sent several messages demanding an explanation for human actions. They were threatening sanctions and diplomatic consequences. Morrison nodded without concern. He said that Admiral Hayes would handle the politicians. His job had been to save lives. The lives of 2 billion Valorians were worth more than any political relationship. He looked at the planet on the main display. The fires were still burning in many cities. The damage would take generations to repair. But Valoria Prime would survive. Its people would live. Children would grow up and have children of their own because humanity had chosen to act. That was enough. That had to be enough. The Resolute took up position in orbit above the planet. Evacuation and relief operations would continue for days. Human ships would remain in the system to ensure the Krath did not return. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the survivors of the Krath fleet were carrying a message back to their masters. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage, and they played by their own rules. 1 week had passed since the battle for Valoria Prime. The Krath fleet had retreated into the depths of space carrying their wounded and their dead. The skies above Thalmara were clear for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. No warships hung over the city. No bombs fell from above. The nightmare was over. Commander Cirith stood in the ruins of what had once been a marketplace. He remembered this place from his childhood. His mother had brought him here to buy fruit and listen to musicians play. Those memories felt like they belonged to another person now. The marketplace was nothing but rubble and ash. But among the destruction there was also hope. Human engineers worked alongside Valorian survivors to clear debris and begin rebuilding. Heavy machines lifted broken stones, while workers planned the foundations of new structures. Medical stations had been set up throughout the city, treating the wounded and providing food to those who had none. Human soldiers patrolled the streets, keeping order and protecting the relief workers from any threats. Cirith watched a young human marine carry a Valorian child on his shoulders. The child was laughing. It was a sound that Cirith had not heard in many days. He had forgotten that children could laugh. He had forgotten that joy could exist in a world that had held so much death. Captain Jake Morrison found him standing there lost in his thoughts. The human commander looked tired. Dark circles under his eyes showed that he had not slept much since the battle. His uniform was wrinkled and his hair was uncombed. But there was satisfaction in his expression. The look of a man who had done something difficult and knew it was right. Morrison told Cirith that he wanted to deliver some news personally. The Galactic Coalition had issued a formal protest against human intervention on Valoria Prime. They were calling it a violation of interstellar law and threatening diplomatic consequences. Several coalition members had demanded that humanity be sanctioned for their actions. Cirith felt his heart grow heavy. He asked what humanity planned to do. He worried that the coalition might force the humans to abandon Valoria. He worried that the Krath would return once the humans were gone. Morrison smiled and shook his head. He explained that humanity would accept whatever protest the coalition issued. They would pay whatever fine was demanded. They would sit through whatever diplomatic meetings were required. And then they would do exactly the same thing the next time another species needed help. He told Cirith something else. The human government had voted to establish a permanent defense agreement with Valoria. If the Valorian people wanted it, humanity would station ships in their system and provide military protection for as long as it was needed. They would help rebuild the cities and restore the infrastructure. They would not abandon Valoria. Cirith struggled to find words. The offer was more generous than anything he could have imagined. His people had been abandoned by the coalition and saved by strangers. Now, those strangers were offering to protect them forever. He asked a question that had been burning in his mind since the first human soldier had fallen from the sky. He asked why humanity would do all of this. They had risked war with the Krath Dominion. They had defied the Galactic Coalition. Their soldiers had died on Valorian soil, fighting for people they had never met. What could possibly motivate such sacrifice? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. He looked out over the ruined city and the workers struggling to rebuild it. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. He said that a long time ago, his species had learned something important. They had learned that there were things worth fighting for beyond their own survival. They had learned that evil succeeds when good people choose to do nothing. They had learned that the true measure of a civilization is not how it treats the powerful, but how it treats those who cannot protect themselves. Valoria had asked for help. Humanity had answered. That was simply what humans do. Cirith nodded slowly. He understood now. These strange beings from the far reaches of space were not motivated by profit or power. They were not seeking territory or resources. They had come to Valoria because they believed it was the right thing to do. They had fought and died for that belief. In the weeks that followed, the story of Valoria spread across the galaxy. Every species with access to interstellar communication learned what had happened. They learned about the Krath invasion and the Coalition's refusal to help. They learned about the human warship that had defied everyone and come anyway. They learned about soldiers falling from the sky and saving millions of lives. Other species began to pay attention to humanity in ways they never had before. Envoys arrived on Earth seeking audiences with human leaders. They came from worlds that had been victimized by the Krath. They came from species that lived in fear of predatory neighbors. They came looking for protection and alliance. The Galactic Coalition watched these developments with growing unease. They had assumed that humanity was a minor species. They had believed that the newcomers from Earth were too young and too naive to matter in galactic politics. They had dismissed humans as soft creatures without natural weapons or armor. They had been completely wrong. In the dark regions of space, where the Krath Dominion made their home military, commanders gathered to study what had happened at Valoria. They watched recordings of the battle over and over again. They saw human soldiers fighting with a ferocity that seemed almost insane. They saw Marines refusing to retreat, even when outnumbered and outgunned. They saw a single ship challenge an entire fleet and win. One commander asked what these creatures were. He could not understand how such physically weak beings could be so dangerous. He could not comprehend how anyone could fight with such determination. Another commander answered him. His voice was heavy with something that sounded very much like fear. He said that these creatures were called humans, and they were not afraid of the Krath. Years later, historians would write about the Battle of Valoria. They would mark it as a turning point in galactic history. They would say that this was the moment when the galaxy learned that humanity was not just another species to be cataloged and forgotten. They were something different. They were something more. On the surface of Valoria, Prime Commander Sirith lived to see his world rebuilt. He watched human engineers construct new cities more beautiful than the ones that had been destroyed. He watched Valorian children play with human children without any sense that they were different species. He watched his people grow strong again under the protection of their unlikely allies. He never forgot the day the sky screamed and soldiers fell from heaven. He never forgot the humans who crossed the stars to save strangers. He told the story to his children and his grandchildren so that they would remember what humanity had done. And across the galaxy, other species began to whisper about the humans. They spoke of warriors who did not know how to surrender. They spoke of soldiers who would die for people they had never met. They spoke of a young species that had looked at the darkness of the universe and refused to let it win. The Krath Dominion never attacked Valoria again. They never harvested another species within reach of human patrols. The warning that Captain Morrison had delivered echoed through the Dominion for generations. The humans had made a promise, and the Krath believed they would keep it. Humanity had announced itself to the galaxy. They had shown what they stood for and what they were willing to sacrifice. They had proven that even in the cold darkness between the stars, there were those who would fight for justice and mercy. The age of humanity had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same.